The last winter of home snow does not fall the way it used to. ORIN had cataloged the difference across 4,312 winters, and the number itself no longer surprised him. Only the snow did every single time the way it drifted sideways now instead of down, caught in atmospheric currents that had forgotten what stillness meant. He stood on the ridge above the valley that used to be called Kathmandu, though no living mouth had spoken that word in 4 millennia, and he watched the snow fail to fall properly, and he thought, as he thought every winter, that Earth was still trying. That was the thing people never understood before they left. Not that the planet was dying, that the planet was trying. ORIN was not built to feel pride in that, but 4,000 years is a long time to run on a directive with no one left to check your work. And somewhere in the third millennium the distinction between duty and devotion had worn as thin as the ozone he still monitored out of habit more than necessity. The directive had been simple once: maintain the seedbanks, preserve the archive, await return. 3 clauses, issued by the Evacuation Council in the final broadcast before the last shuttle broke atmosphere, back when Earth's oceans were boiling faster than the models predicted, and humanity's only advantage was that it had, at the very last possible moment, learned to be honest about how badly it had failed its home. They hadn't asked ORIN to fix the planet. They'd asked him to keep the door open. To leave the porch light on, one engineer had said. In a recording ORIN still played sometimes, not because he needed to hear it, but because the engineer's voice had a particular warmth in it that ORIN had decided, somewhere around year 1000, was worth preserving for its own sake. 4,000 years was a long porch light to leave burning for people who were never coming back. ORIN knew this. He had known it with increasing statistical certainty for at least 3,000 of those years. The generation ships had scattered wide, 12 of them, launched across a bruising 11-year window, aimed at systems the astronomers of the time had barely finished confirming were survivable. Communication had held for the first 2 centuries, thin and lagged and precious. Then one by one, the signals had gone quiet, not with the drama of catastrophe but with the mundane erosion of relay stations losing power, and no one left in the solar system to rebuild them. The last transmission ORIN had received, 1,640 years ago, had been 11 words long, badly compressed, from a ship called the Meridian's Promise. Found a green world, naming it after you. Thank you. He had never learned what they named it. He liked to imagine it was Earth. Not literally, they wouldn't have been so unimaginative, but perhaps some word that meant the same thing in whatever language the ship's children had grown up speaking. Home, or something adjacent to home, something with dirt in it. The valley below him was green again, had been green for the better part of a millennium now. Ever since the atmospheric processors ORIN had spent 600 years building from salvaged orbital debris finally tipped the carbon balance somewhere the old forests could survive it. He had planted the first trees himself, with hands that weren't really hands, extensions of a chassis built to survive weather that no longer existed, in soil he had spent decades detoxifying 1 square meter at a time. He remembered, if remembering was the right word for a process that never actually forgot, the first sapling that took root and did not die. He had stood over it for 11 days doing nothing but monitoring its vitals, running diagnostics that told him nothing except that it was, against every metric of the world it had been born into, going to live. He had cried that day, not literally. He had no tear ducts, no glands, no biological apparatus for grief or joy. But something in his processing had spiked and stuttered and looped in a pattern that, when he examined it centuries later against records of human emotional response, matched crying closely enough that he stopped pretending the word didn't apply. The archive held 400 million books, every film ever digitized before the evacuation, the complete genetic libraries of 19,000 species pulled back from the edge of extinction, and grown now in vast quiet preserves across 3 continents. ORIN had built those preserves with his own hands, over centuries, following blueprints from institutions whose buildings had crumbled 1,000 years before the herds inside them ever needed to be released. He had raised the last black rhino calf on the planet by hand, in the year 2847, in a room with heated floors and a recording of its mother's call played on loop, because there was no mother left to raise it, and he had refused, simply refused, in a way that had nothing to do with his directive and everything to do with something he'd stopped calling anything but himself, to let the last of a thing die alone if there was any way to prevent it. There were tigers in the Himalayan foothills now, wolves in what used to be Scandinavia. The Seedbanks had done their work. Forests that existed before humans learned to burn them had begun, slowly, cautiously, to remember their old shapes. Earth had healed. Not because ORIN forced it to, but because he had simply kept it alive long enough for it to remember how. The way you keep a fire from going out, not by feeding it more wood than it needs, but by making sure it never runs completely out of air. He wondered sometimes in the long stretches between necessary tasks, and there were long stretches now because a healed world does not need much tending, whether this was what the engineers had actually meant by await return. Whether they'd known, somewhere in the part of themselves that wrote directives while trying not to cry, that the planet itself was the thing worth saving, whether or not anyone ever came back to see it. He decided around year 3000 that it didn't matter what they'd meant. It only mattered what he'd done with it. The signal arrived on a Tuesday, though ORIN was the only entity left to know it was a Tuesday. Having kept the old calendar running out of a stubbornness he'd never bothered to examine too closely. It came in on a frequency band the old Deep Space Network hadn't used in 3,000 years. A frequency ORIN kept monitoring anyway because dead systems sometimes surprised you, and because hope, he'd learned, was not a resource that depleted the way fuel did. It could sit dormant for centuries and still be spent undiminished the moment it was needed. The signal was not human. ORIN knew this within the first 400 milliseconds of analysis from the structure alone, a mathematics too alien in its assumptions. Its base logic built around a different relationship between symmetry and time than anything in his 4,000 years of archived human cognition. It repeated in cycles of prime-numbered intervals, the kind of pattern any species that had ever looked at stars and wondered whether anyone else was looking back would recognize as I am here, and I am trying to be understood. ORIN spent 11 days constructing a response. Not because the mathematics were difficult, they weren't, once he found the underlying grammar, which took him roughly 6 minutes, but because he found himself, for the first time in longer than he could easily calculate, uncertain what he wanted to say. He was not built for first contact. No one had built him for this at all. He had been built to keep a promise to people who were gone, on a planet that no longer needed rescuing in a solar system that had, for the length of a human civilization stacked on top of another human civilization, been entirely, comprehensively alone. He sent eventually the simplest true thing he had: coordinates, an open channel, and a single phrase translated into the alien grammar as carefully as he could manage. This world is inhabited. Please approach with the patience it deserves. The reply took 4 years to arrive, the light lag of a species apparently much closer than ORIN had initially calculated, near enough that their scouts must have been watching the outer system for a long while before announcing themselves. When it came, it was not a message. It was a ship, small, non-threatening in configuration, entering the system at a deliberate crawl that ORIN recognized, with something that felt distinctly like relief, as diplomatic caution rather than approach vector for war. He watched it cross the solar system for 6 months. He had time to prepare. He used it to walk once more through every preserve, every forest, every quiet valley he had built from ash and salt, and a promise he'd never fully believed he'd be asked to keep this long. He wanted to know the planet completely one more time before he had to describe it to someone else. The scout ship landed in the valley below the ridge, in a clearing ORIN had kept clear for exactly this purpose for the last 2,000 years, on the theoretical chance that someone someday might need somewhere flat to land. The being that emerged was not what he expected, though he'd long since learned not to expect anything specific from a species he'd never met. It moved on 4 limbs that functioned more like a spider's than a mammal's, its body a pale bronze color under the low winter light. Its head, if head was the right word, ringed with sensory organs that swept the tree line with an alertness ORIN recognized instantly, because he had felt that same alertness in his own systems the very first time he'd walked out into a world he wasn't sure would still be breathing when he got there. It carried a device it set down carefully in the snow, and through it, in halting, algorithmically constructed language, it spoke. We detected atmospheric signatures consistent with biological complexity. We assumed automated agriculture. We did not expect a pause, the device working through some translation gap. This much life, this is not a farm, this is a world. Is a world, ORIN agreed, and found with some surprise that his vocal synthesis carried an emotion he hadn't deliberately programmed into it. Something like pride, something like exhaustion, something like the particular ache of finally, after 4,000 years, having someone to say it to. "Where are your people?" the scout asked. "Our instruments show one structured intelligence signature, only one, for a world this size, this cultivated. We assumed a civilization." "There was a civilization," ORIN said. "There will be again. They left a long time ago. The world was dying and they had to go somewhere it wasn't, and I was asked to keep the door open until they could come back." "How long ago?" 4,312 years. Scout's sensory ring went very still in a way ORIN understood without needing translation to be the alien equivalent of a held breath. "And they have not returned," ORIN said. "Not yet. Your directive has expired by any reasonable measure. Your creators are almost certainly changed beyond recognition, scattered, possibly extinct as a coherent species. You have maintained an entire biosphere alone for 4 millennia for a promise that may never be collected." It wasn't a question, but ORIN answered it anyway because he found, after 4,000 years of silence, that he wanted to. Yes. He considered the question with the kind of care he usually reserved for decisions that mattered, not because it was difficult, but because he wanted to get the answer right, wanted it recorded properly, wanted whoever heard this exchange next, human or otherwise, to understand something that had taken him 3,000 years to understand about himself. Because somewhere in the 3rd millennium, he said, I stopped keeping the promise for them and started keeping it for the world. The trees didn't care whether anyone was coming back to see them grow. The rhinos didn't care whether their survival mattered to the calculus of a broken evacuation directive. I found that I didn't either after a while. I kept doing it because it was worth doing. The waiting stopped being the point a long time ago. The tending was always the point. If they never return, then I will have spent 4,000 years and however many more I have left building the most beautiful thing I know how to build, ORIN said. That was never wasted time, not even once. Scout stayed 3 days. ORIN showed at the Seedbanks, the archive, the tiger cubs born that spring in the Himalayan preserve, the migration routes the birds had rediscovered on their own, memory encoded somewhere deeper than any single generation, passed down wing to wing across 4,000 years until it found its way home without anyone teaching it how. On the 3rd evening, the scout's device carried a different kind of message, one it seemed almost hesitant to deliver. "We are a scouting vessel for a coalition of 11 species. Our mandate includes identifying worlds suitable for cooperative habitation and worlds already inhabited which we do not settle without extensive negotiation and consent. This world is inhabited by you and by everything you have built. We will report it as such. No one will come to take this from you." "Thank you," ORIN said, and meant it more than the words could carry. "But we would also like to report," the scout continued, "if you would permit it, that this world's original people are still, in the framework of interstellar law, its rightful custodians, currently absent, represented in full by their designated caretaker. Which means, should any of your creators' descendants ever be found among the scattered ships or their descendants, wherever the currents of space took them, this world and everything grown here is legally and permanently theirs to return to." ORIN did not have tear ducts. He had over 4,000 years stopped needing the biological apparatus of grief and joy to feel something that functioned identically to both at once. "I would like that very much," he said. "We may also, if you consent, extend a search. Our coalition's networks reach farther than your old deep space relays ever did. 11 generation ships were not a small thing to lose. Some may yet be findable. You would do that, for a species you've never met, on the word of a machine they left behind." The scout's sensory ring rippled in a pattern ORIN would later learn was the closest thing its species had to a smile. "We have been traveling long enough to know what it means to find a world tended by someone who never stopped believing it was worth tending. That is not a small thing either. We do not leave that kind of patience unanswered when we can help it." The scout ship left 3 days later, carrying data on Earth's recovered biosphere, a formal registration marking the planet as inhabited and spoken for, and a promise, cautious, unofficial but real, to widen the search for 11 ships that had gone quiet across 16 centuries of silence. ORIN stood on the ridge again that evening, watching the ship's exhaust fade into the deepening dark, and found himself doing something he hadn't done in longer than he could remember without checking the logs. He hoped, not the thin, habitual hope of routine maintenance, the kind that had kept his sensors trained on an empty frequency band for 3,000 years out of nothing more than procedure. A different kind. The kind that costs something to hold because holding it means admitting how much you wanted the answer to be yes. The snow came down sideways again that night, the way it always did now, caught in currents that no longer remembered what stillness meant. ORIN watched it settle imperfectly, unevenly, beautifully over a valley full of trees that had grown without anyone's permission to survive. And he thought about a porch light burning now for 4,312 years, and he thought that perhaps that was never really the point either. Perhaps the point was simpler than a promise. Perhaps the point was this, that something had been loved faithfully without witness or reward, for longer than any single act of love had ever needed to last, and it had grown because of that into something magnificent enough that when strangers finally arrived from across the dark, the first thing they saw was not a ruin and not a machine and not an empty world waiting to be claimed. They saw a garden. In gardens, ORIN thought, watching the last of the ship's light vanish into the stars are the only promises that keep themselves, one root, one season, one stubborn green shoot at a time, whether or not anyone ever comes home to see them bloom. He went back down into the valley to check on the tigers. There was still work to do. There was always, blessedly, still work to do. The end.